Read Kayak, Chapter 11. There was a funeral for Ben a couple days later. A friend of the D'Angelos called to invite us. The funeral was out in Leesburg, Virginia, where they're from. But I didn't want to go. My parents said that was fine. They said they understood if I didn't want to go, but I think Mom worried about me. The day of the funeral, she asked me to drive into Centerville with her to help with the grocery shopping and errands. And she took me to lunch at Pizza Hut, and we almost never eat lunch out. I could feel her keeping an eye on me while I played with the straw in my soda. Pushing her salad plate to the side, Mom picked up her coffee and said, "Brady, you need to put this behind you and move forward." Her words echoed Carl's. "I know," I agreed, "but how did you do that?" Every day I kept thinking about what had happened on the river, and I couldn't seem to get the traction I needed for forward motion. "Do you want to take the rest home?" Mom asked gently. I stared at the uneaten half of my small pizza, not caring, but I nodded because we never waste food. Across the street, Mom pulled into a parking place at the new shopping center my father hated because it had sprung up in what used to be a cornfield where we went hunting as a kid. I wasn't particular. In fact, I never minded an excuse to go anywhere outside of our town, if you can call it that. All we have at Bailey's Wharf is a crossroads near school where there's a post office and the firehouse, a gas station that sells bait, a video store, and the 7-Eleven. "Are you all right?" Mom asked, pulling the keys out of the ignition. "Yeah." She handed me a piece of paper with the things Dad needed from the hardware store and a $20 bill. "I'll meet you back here in half an hour, okay?" When I finished buying the clamps and sandpaper Dad needed, I saw that I still had 20 minutes before meeting Mom, so I drifted into the dollar store to poke around and remembered I needed batteries for my CD player. Some little kids were in the store examining the new Spider-Man action figure, seeing what it could do. And I thought of Ben, and I couldn't help myself. I tried to imagine what his funeral was like. I had never been to a funeral, not even Amanda's. Carl took me up to the National Aquarium in Baltimore the day they buried my sister, and I didn't know until it was over. I'm sure my parents thought they were protecting me, but I always felt cheated. Like it left yet another hole in my life. It irritates me even now when I think of how I rode all those escalators to see a bunch of fancy seahorses and polka-dotted fish when I could have been there saying goodbye to Amanda one last time. This is the truth. After that, I never once wanted to go back to that aquarium, not even when 4th grade went there on a field trip. Mom never knew it, but I faked a stomachache that day. "Excuse me, are you okay?" The woman behind the register narrowed her eyes as she peered at me. I must have looked kind of spaced out. "No, I don't think so," I mumbled, turning to walk out and forgetting all about the batteries. After we got home that day, it started raining again. It rained practically the entire spring vacation. During that break, I worked on a term paper for English, and I hoped that JT or Digger would call. They didn't. At the end of the week, Carl asked me to go with him while he took his mother, my Aunt Tracy, who doesn't drive, down to Richmond so she could stay for a few days and help her dad move into a nursing home. Even though we're cousins, I had never met Carl's other grandfather before. He's real old now, and he has that disease where you forget. He didn't even know Carl or my aunt when we walked in. "It's me, Tracy," my aunt told him. "Your daughter," she said, opening her arms for a hug, but Carl's grandfather didn't recognize her and even backed away, knocking a chair over. For hours, we packed up boxes for Carl's grandfather. All his sweaters and socks and towels, even his silverware and his coffee mugs. Carl's grandfather watched game shows on television the whole time, except when he occasionally got up to tell us we needed to hurry because he was late for work. Afterward, we ordered some Chinese food and spent the night, Aunt Tracy in the guest room, Carl on the couch, and me on a funky futon thing his grandfather had. The next morning, other relatives were coming to help. Carl had to get back for his shift, though, so he and I got up early and left. We drove through a Burger King for breakfast and then got right back on Route 301 and drove north. "I feel sorry for your mom," I told Carl. "It's going to be a hard week for her." "Yeah, but you know Mom, Brady. She wouldn't be happy if she wasn't helping somebody." True, I thought. My Aunt Tracy had a heart of gold, and if you ask me, so did Carl. the way he was always helping her and us. And it started me thinking that maybe there was more I could be doing, like for the D'Angelos. By the time we got back from Richmond, it had stopped raining, and even though we'd only been gone for a day, it seemed as if spring had suddenly moved into Maryland. Clusters of daffodils and pudgy little purple hyacinths had sprouted up all over our yard. The ground was squishy from water, and behind the house, where Mom had started raking out her butterfly garden, the earthy scent of marsh drifted up from the river. That evening, Mom fried a rockfish and served one of her applesauce cakes for dessert. It was a nice dinner. You could tell we were all trying to make a fresh start and get things back to normal. "Anything happen while I was gone?" I asked, digging into my cake. "Well, let's see." Dad scratched his head. "The locusts are in bloom, so that means the crabs is having their first molt. See, too, that Mr. Hennessy down the road planted his soybean field." Mom smiled and lifted her eyebrows. "Uncle Henry brought me a bag of manure for the garden." I snorted. "Okay, what I meant is, did anything exciting happen?" Mom and Dad looked at each other. "Like, did anyone call?" I prodded. "Yes," Mom replied. "Your Aunt Janet called from Rhode Island. She wants you to go up and spend a week with them when school gets out." I knew they'd contrived the trip to get my mind off of things. I half smiled. "Anybody else?" Slowly, Mom shook her head. "No, I don't think so." Neither JT nor Digger had called then. I felt my heart dip. The whole week had passed, and neither of them had called. "It rained the entire time you were gone," Mom reminded me, like maybe that was an excuse. But on rainy days, the three of us had some of our best times down in JT's basement. His family had one of those big screen TVs and an air hockey table, too. I cut a big forkful of cake and pushed it into my mouth with a lot of resolve behind it. Good friends wouldn't ignore me like this, I thought. I was going to let those guys get to me, or wasn't going to let those guys get to me, and in the meantime, I would show Ben's family just how sorry I was about what had happened. And after I swallowed, I announced, "I'm going to offer my help to the D'Angelos." My parents seemed surprised. Dad shrugged. "Great idea," he said. "What kind of help?" Mom wanted to know. "Anything. Rake the yard, mow the lawn, whatever they need." Mom appeared thoughtful as she stirred her tea. "I heard from someone at the grocery store that Gina, Mrs. D'Angelo, is over there by herself," she said. I'm sure she would appreciate your offer." "What do you mean?" "Mrs. D'Angelo is over there by herself. Where's Mr. D'Angelo?" I asked. Mom kept stirring her tea. "Well, they have an apartment in Northern Virginia. Maybe he's staying there." I stopped eating. I don't get it. Why would she be there alone? It was getting a little tense in our dining room. I looked from Mom to Dad and then back to Mom again. She set her spoon down on her saucer. "Sometimes," she said gingerly, "when there's been a death, it drives a family apart instead of together." At first that didn't make a lick of sense to me. You'd think people would hold tight after a tragedy like the one with Ben, but then I only had to think back on what happened to my sister and watch Mom bite her lip to realize it didn't always work that way. My father got up and left. This was way past his comfort level. Mom reached over to touch my hand. "They need some time, Brady, and maybe what they need right now is time apart." After I heard Mrs. D'Angelo was over there alone, I was more determined than ever to help her. So the next day, Sunday, I asked Mom for her help, and we made a spinach lasagna and put the ingredients for a spicy Italian bread into the bread machine. I didn't mind the cooking. I felt as though I was an old hand in the kitchen ever since those days at the fire station. Even so, I made one heck of a mess spilling flour all over the place, including on Tilly, because she was right under my feet the whole time. As soon as the bread machine beeped, I pulled the loaf out, wrapped it in tinfoil, and put it in a cardboard box with the tray of lasagna. Mom had also picked a thick bunch of daffodils, which she put in a coffee can with water and nestled into a corner of the box. On top, I settled a folded note, offered my help. I signed my name and left a phone number and an email address. Mom had done so much of the work I wanted her to come too, but at the last minute she said she couldn't, and Dad took me. The box was warm on my lap. I was proud of what Mom and I had created. Halfway up the D'Angelo's driveway, though, I had a terrible thought. What if Mrs. D'Angelo didn't want visitors? And me in particular. I mean, what if she closed the door in my face? What if she didn't know how hard I tried to save Ben? The D'Angelo's driveway is pretty long, winding across the field where JT, Digger, and I used to shoot tin cans. So there was a lot of time for me to agonize over this. When the D'Angelo's huge brick house came into view, Dad slowed his pickup and parked behind a new black Saab. The D'Angelo's had 4 cars, including a silver Porsche that JT lusted after. I didn't see the Porsche, though. Maybe Mr. D'Angelo had it over at that apartment in Virginia. We rang the doorbell a few times and waited at least 10 minutes, but nobody ever came. And disappointed, we set the box by the door and left. Dad didn't say anything on the drive back home. Not that it's unusual for Dad to be quiet, but I could tell something was eating at him. When we walked into the kitchen where Mom was unloading the dishwasher, he finally told me, "Look, Brady," he began, "I know it's been hard, but it's time to be getting on. I got way too much to do to take on your chores, too." Mom held a stack of plates. The room grew quiet. "Either do something with those crab pots tomorrow or pull them in," Dad said. I hadn't thought a lick about crabbing. Not a lick. Even if I didn't rebait them, I knew I needed to move the pots around. If you don't, sometimes on Dad's boat we even hose them off. They'll gunk up and disintegrate. Dad turned the cap in his hands. "One other thing," he went on. "I know you kids must have been in my shop sometime over the past few weeks, and you took my drill. The cordless one, the one that runs on batteries, I can't find it anywhere and I need it." "We didn't take it, Dad. I know we didn't." I insisted, hurt because I'm really good at putting things back, especially if it was something from his shop. My father let out his breath like he didn't believe me, and then he set his cap and his truck keys on the counter and he left. Mom could tell Dad had hurt my feelings. In a soft voice, she explained how he had been under some pressure lately to join the other watermen in a protest against the state's new crabbing regulations. "They're talking about petitioning the governor and demonstrating over in Annapolis," she said. "And Dad doesn't want to do it?" She made a face and shrugged. "He's been kind of funny about it, like he's not sure. But I don't see how he can't go along with the others. It's his livelihood, Brady. It's what puts food on this table." I stood, staring down the hallway after my dad. I hated to let my father down. I hated it, especially if he was having problems of his own. So I set my alarm for 4 a.m. in order to check my crab pots before school, laid out my clothes for the morning. I even made 2 peanut butter and honey sandwiches and left them in the refrigerator beside a bottle of Gatorade so I could grab them on my way out the door. It was brutal when that buzzer went off. I moaned and pushed the warm covers off. On automatic pilot, I got dressed and I let Tilly out. Then I shoved the sandwiches in my coat pocket, grabbed the Gatorade, and scooped up the flashlight at the end of the counter. The house was silent. Monday was Dad's day to work in the shop, so he and Mom wouldn't be up for another 2 hours. Outside the tool shed, I picked up a basket to fill with razor clams from the refrigerator. But even before I opened the door to fetch the bait, I could feel how something had shut down inside of me. With the empty basket still in my hand, I walked along the short path to the dock. By then, my eyes had adjusted to the dark. I flicked the flashlight off and I stood there staring out over the creek. Tilly had hopped into my boat and was waiting. But I knew I couldn't go back out on the water. Not because I was afraid or because I blamed the river for what happened. It was because of an overwhelming sadness that came over me being near the water. In the hazy morning air, all I could see was a red kayak sunk in the river and Ben's half-closed eyes and cold blue lips. Whatever it was inside of me that had shut down, curled inward. In the kitchen, I left a note for Dad saying my engine was broke and I went back to bed. Tilly seemed to understand and lay quietly on the rug beside me. Later that day, when I got home from school, Dad told me 2 terrapins had drowned in my pots. I wondered how he knew. But walking out back, I could see that my father had pulled every one of my traps and stacked them up, 4 deep, behind the shed.